I want to talk about something that's very controversial, and it's related directly to this price ceiling discussion that we've just had. The issue is price gouging laws, right? And these are laws that have been put into place, and about 34 states have price gouging laws in place. And these are very, very popular. And what I'm going to tell you now is going to fly in the face of what most people's intuition is and what most people want or think they want. Right? So the economists have been making this argument for a long time. Quite honestly, nobody listens to us because they just don't buy that this letting the market work is better than trying to have the government intervene to improve the market. What I'm going to try to suggest, I'm going to give you the economic argument here. I'm going to try to suggest that these price gouging laws, again, from the vantage point of economic efficiency and in terms of welfare, well-being effects for the people that are trying to be helped, and actually the price gouging laws probably make things worse for people rather than better. And that the problems we have are often caused more by the government intervention here than they are if we just let things alone and let the market control things. Okay, so let me give you more background to this. First of all, what happens? Price gouging laws are activated in the case of emergencies. And emergencies might be a snowstorm that's about to hit, or a hurricane that's about to hit, or anything that disrupts the supply patterns, especially in a particular market area. Okay, and what will happen when there's a sudden drop in supply or increase in demand is that merchants will often respond by raising their prices. Now, people in general have a very negative impression about businesses and businesses making profits, especially high profits. And people are especially negative about individual firms making profits in an emergency situation. So if merchants raise their prices in response to changing market conditions because of an imminent emergency, they get called out. People complain vehemently about the increase in prices, the profiteering that's taking place, the bad intent that's assumed about the merchants themselves. Now let's see how this comes about. So let's suppose we've got a hurricane that's about to hit a particular area, Florida, for example. In today's day and age, we know that that hurricane is coming, and we know that the damage is going to take place and that there's going to be a disruption in supplies as a result of, destruction of a downing of power lines. Electricity is likely to go out. We're likely to lose the ability of gas supplies to our gasoline service stations. That might be curtailed for a period of time. There's going to be a lot of emergency cleanup that's going to be necessary. There's going to be a demand for generators because electricity is out. There's going to be a demand for ice because your refrigerators don't work anymore. There's going to be a demand for gasoline to run your generator and to run your chainsaw and things like that. A snowstorm is coming. There's going to be a demand for shovels and snow blowing equipment and plows and things like that. All sorts of things will be anticipated to be needed and will be in shorter supply as a result of the impending emergency that's about to happen. Now let's go to our market over here, our diagram, and let's imagine we're imagining the market for gasoline in a particular area that's about to be hit by a hurricane. Now, first of all, I want to highlight what's going to happen in the short run. So let's say P0 and Q1 is the original equilibrium in the marketplace. Okay, so, and this is going to be your $2 per gasoline kind of price. That is common and prevailing over the course of several weeks or months before the hurricane. All right, well, when the hurricane is about to hit, one of the things that's going to happen is that people are going to say, hey, gasoline might be in short supply next week, or in our economic model, we might say we anticipate the price to be higher because it's going to be short supply. And what that's going to do is that's going to increase the demand for the product. There's going to be an increase in what we might call precautionary demand. Demand for the product because you think you're not going to have it next week. So even before the hurricane hits, demand for gasoline is likely to go up. All right? The second thing that might happen is that supplies might be cut off somewhat. And that's going to be cut off maybe in the short term as merchants say, hey, maybe I'll be able to get a higher price after the emergency. So this kind of profit incentive might prevail. And producers might cut back their supply in the days leading up to the emergency so as to wait and have it available after the hurricane hits. That would cause a drop in supply. The secondary drop in supply supply will happen and increase in demand will happen when the hurricane actually hits and in the near aftermath. Because one thing that happens if electricity gets cut out and if there's not enough generators, you can't pump the gas up from the tanks below the service station into the cars and trucks that are waiting. So you might have a disruption in supply because you just can't physically get it out. That drop in supply then is going to be reflected by a decrease in the supply measured here, an increase in demand for precautionary purposes, and then what our market model says should happen is that the price of the product should rise, and the quantity is going to fall as a result of these two changes. Okay, but the major increase, both the drop in supply and the increase in demand, is going to lead to an increase in the price. And maybe that price in the market would rise from $2, to, I don't know, $6 or something. It could be a considerable increase in price in the near aftermath of the hurricane. All right, but that's not really what happens. Prices don't rise like that in emergency situations. Why? First of all, because the general public reacts very strongly and negatively to any gasoline merchant that raises their price. They will respond and say, oh my gosh, how could they be so unconscionable at a time of emergency to raise their prices and try to make a profit in this particular environment? So that's the first sentiment that inspires adjustments or changes to what might be the normal market reaction to this. Some merchants might disregard that. But in states where there's price gouging laws actually will prevent the merchants from doing that anyway. But even if it's not, even if the state doesn't have the price gouging laws, the public reaction is usually so strong and so negative that merchants will be disinclined to raise their prices, even if that seems to be the appropriate market response right now. So they're pressured not to raise their prices. Some might try to get away with it, some won't. Our natural inclination for most folks is to think it's just the right thing to do to keep the price low, and that they shouldn't try to profit in this particular situation. Okay, let's go with that. Let's assume that that's what they do. They don't raise their prices. And let's say, in fact, that consumers who are so angry about this activity go to their state legislatures, as many have, and insist that they implement price gouging laws. Now, most of the price gouging laws have this language. They say it prevents unconscionable price increases that just any reasonable person would look at and say, you just shouldn't be doing that right now. And they're often closely prescribed to only be relevant in an emergency situation. It's often prescribed to be only, you can't raise your prices in certain sensitive and items that are in great need and are likely to be in great short supply during an emergency situation. All right, so let's analyze what happens because of those price gouging laws, and let's compare it to a situation where there are no price gouging laws. Okay, so a price gouging law, first of all, acts like a price ceiling. When supply shifts left and demand shifts right and the market price would rise up to this much higher level, the price gouging law says, nope, can't do it. Got to keep the price at the original price P0. But the supply is still going to change, and the demand is still going to change. Supply is not going to be there because you can't supply gasoline very quickly in the emergency. Supply chains have been broken because of the damage that's taken place. So supply has got to go down. Demand is going to go up because of the new needs for gasoline to run generators and chainsaws and this and that, and to give people more calm that they have enough gas to get them through the next couple of days or weeks. Right? So the demand and supply is definitely going to change. The price gouging law is going to keep the price at the original level P sub C. That means the quantity is going to fall from Q sub 1 to something like Q sub 0. Because demand is out here now at Q sub 2 because of the extra demand, but supply has been cut back, you're going to have excess demand for the product. So what happens? Well, lines are going to happen. You're going to get this much unsatisfied demand, and everybody is going to be looking at the gas station going, oh my gosh, there's only a limited amount of gas. I better get in line so I can be the first one there. Now, as the days progress and the supply is continued to be reduced, what's going to happen is that one gasoline station is going to have gas, have a line of people line up, they will sell the gas, but it's going to run out. And when it runs out, you're going to wait to see where some other station gets a new supply of gasoline, maybe because a truck gets through, a tanker truck gets through and resupplies them. And everybody's going to line up at the other gas station and wait to try to get and purchase that gasoline. There's a second thing that happens. Those lines are going to happen, first of all. And we've seen that happen over and over again. Whenever a hurricane is about to hit, you'll see big lines at gas stations. Okay? Now, the other thing that happens is that the merchants selling gasoline and forced to keep the price at the original level are going to realize that some people are going to come in, these extra demanders. They're going to say, hey, I want to fill up my tank because I don't know when I'm going to be able to get gas again. And I want to maybe fill up my gas tank in the back of my truck as well. I'm going to fill that up. In other words, demands by people are going to be over and above what they might normally need or even need in this emergency situation, because they're going to be worried about how long this supply disruption is going to last. So what gas stations will do in this circumstance is they'll put a limit on how much you can buy. So you wait in line for hours and hours, you get up to the pump and they'll say 10 gallons, that's it. No more than 10 gallons into your tank. You're not allowed to put anything more in. So they allocate in that way, a fixed amount of product is being allocated to everybody, again, who's lucky enough to be the first ones in line and actually get the product. All right, let's talk a little bit, based on what we've just learned, on what happens if the price gouging law is enforced and what some of the pros and cons of that particular policy will be. First of all, let's talk about the pros. People like it. They feel like it's a fairer outcome if the prices stay at their relatively normal levels and people can buy it. Profits to gas firms are not excessive. They're not making an excessive amount of money because they haven't raised their prices. They haven't raised their price way above the cost of supplying that gas in the previous weeks. And so people feel like that's a fair outcome. Other pro, the people who wait long in the lines, they get a small amount of gas, usually that quota amount of 10 gallons or something, and they get to buy it at the usual price. So those people definitely benefit because of the price gouging law that's put into place. The disaster response, though, as we're going to see in comparison, is going to be based more on charity and altruism. So in order to get kind of new things to people, you're not going to be able to rely on the market system to try to allocate new goods and services to people and to resupply people with their lost needs. Instead, you're going to have to rely on the government to kind of move things in, get extra supplies there, because the profit incentive has been choked off. Producers, if anything, are willing to supply less in this market situation rather than more. So the resupply is likely to take longer, but it's going to be based more on charity and altruism rather than self-interest. Okay, what are the cons of doing that? Okay, here, one of the cons that we learned from our price ceiling exercise is that the limited supply of gasoline or other products is going to be allocated randomly and inefficiently, really, by waiting in lines. Inefficiently, I mean people who most need the gasoline are not necessarily going to be the ones who get it. Okay, and the ones who maybe least need the gasoline might be lucky enough to be in the early part of the line, and they might actually get the gasoline. Let me go down here to this bullet point here. Some who don't need the gasoline as much get it. And the story I would tell you is something like a retired individual, like a grandma or grandpa who, has an automobile. They drive their automobile to the supermarket, twice a week. And if they filled up their tank of gasoline, their car with gasoline, it might last a month or a month and a half. Now, these individuals sitting in their apartments watching the hurricane about to hit might say, oh, I've got a half a tank of gasoline. They might know that's going to last another week or two or even a month. But they're going to say, oh, but what if I can't get the gasoline next week when I would normally go to the gas station? I better go now and wait in line in order to fill up, just so that as a precautionary effect, just in case the hurricane is really bad and we don't get gasoline for a long period of time. Now, I'm tilting this story in the direction of this person at the moment doesn't really need that gasoline so much. But they're going to be treated just like everybody else. As long as you're early enough in line, they're going to be able to buy the gasoline at the lower price, and they're going to be able to buy their 10 gallons and go home. At the same time, this other bullet point, some who need the gasoline desperately, those who are way up high on the demand curve, They may not get it. So imagine somebody who works for minimum wages delivering pharmaceuticals for a local drugstore. Those pharmaceuticals are just important to get out and be delivered after the emergency as before, and in fact, it's going to be difficult to do that. Imagine an individual who drives a delivery vehicle around all day long delivering prescriptions. And what they need is they need to have a full tank of gas because every day they use a full tank of gas. Right? And they want to continue their job and continue working during the emergency as best they can. Now, those individuals are going to have to wait in line a long period of time in order to get the gasoline. They're not going to be able to work during the time they're waiting in line. And when they get to the pump, they're only going to be able to get 10 gallons of gasoline, not the full tank that they need in order to do their job for the whole day. So that means they're not going to be able to work as much as they used to. They're only going to earn income for a half a day rather than a full day. They're going to waste a whole bunch of their time waiting in line. And that individual is going to be worse off because they couldn't pay more for gasoline and keep working. All right, now, the opportunity cost of waiting in line is potentially enormous. You've got a whole bunch of people who are sitting all day long just waiting, hoping that they'll move up in the line and be able to fill their tanks with gasoline and go home and then start to do the work that they need to do for the cleanup and whatnot. Because people with different needs will often express themselves in these lines, some people who are desperate for the gasoline will sometimes try to cut in line and try to break in front because they're going to say, hey, listen to my story. I need it more than you do. And they'll try to cut in front of the elderly people who they're going to look at and say, you don't need it. So what do? You're going to have to assign police, which they often do, to these long lines and try to keep order there. That's an extra cost that has to be incurred. The last thing down here at the bottom, though, is that no economic inducement is made to supply more of the gasoline faster. If the price stays at its normal level, then you might have distributors of gasoline in nearby states who would say, hey, I was about to send my gasoline to my service stations in Pennsylvania. I could get it over to New Jersey where the storm has hit, but I'm not going to do that if I don't get any extra money out of that. So they're going to continue with their original supplies, and the supply inducement to supply more to the emergency area is going to be cut off because there is no ability to make some extra money from that. And that's why, again, the relief efforts are going to have to rely on charity and altruism rather than self-interest to try to promote and to get people out of the emergency situation faster. Okay, I've got a few more minutes. Let me go through the other side of things. And this is the part that's hard to get people to accept. But it's just kind of reversing the senses here. What if you didn't have a price gouging law? And what if you could actually get people to accept the economics story that I'm telling here and say, well, of course prices are going to rise when supplies are disrupted like this. That's just a natural thing to happen. If people accepted it and allowed the prices to rise, here's what we think would happen. First of all, lines. Lines are not there because of the emergency. Lines are there because the price has not risen enough. If you raise the price up, you can equalize supply and demand. You'll notice anytime during a normal situation, you never sit back and worry, oh, I wonder if gas is going to be there at the gas station when I go next week up. You just know it's going to be there. You know it's going to be there and you're going to pay the price, and that's what's balancing supply and demand. The same thing would be true in an emergency situation if you allowed the prices to rise, because here's what would happen. If you allow the prices to rise, that delivery person, they're going to pay the extra money for the gas because they're going to say, look, I'm going to do the economic calculation. I need to work all day to make an income. Yes, the gas is more expensive and I don't like it, but I'm going to pay the extra money because I'm going to be able to do my job all day. I'm going to be able to fill up my tank, and then I'm going to make a little bit less all day, but I'm going to be better than if I didn't get to deliver gas at all. Those people are going to still buy the gasoline even if the price is higher. Those with the lowest need, like your grandma or grandpa who just was going to top up their tank for securities purposes, that precautionary demand is going to be stopped because all of those individuals who might fill up an extra gas tank or whatever, they're going to look at the price and go, hey, I'm not going to pay this high price for the product. So one of the most important things about allowing the prices to rise is it allows the allocation to be better directed to the people who actually need the product. And also, you're going to allow, got this down here, determination of who gets the gas is going to be based on self-selection. Individuals themselves are going to decide whether it's too much to pay for or not. And they're going to either buy the gasoline at the higher prices and continue along their business because it's profitable to do so, or they're not. And the people that don't are going to be the ones that need it the less and are going to make a decision that I'll just wait. I'll wait a couple of days and see if the prices come down, and then I'll buy gasoline instead. So the price system actually serves as a method in which you don't have to hear the individual stories of the individual people about their needs or not. Instead, the price system is reallocating and making sure that it goes to the people who need it the most. Now, there's another element that's often missed about the price ceiling and the price gouging law. If you allow the prices to rise, and there is an article that you can read in the extra readings that I want you to, it's about some individuals who decided during an emergency in North Carolina to buy up ice in Tennessee, I think, and then they transported it to North Carolina and they started selling it at a much higher price than the average market price. So instead of selling a bag of ice at $2 a bag, they were selling it for like $8 a bag or something. That's an example of what can happen in an emergency. If you can make extra money, then gas suppliers and ice suppliers and everybody, snow shovel suppliers and chainsaws and generator suppliers, all of them are going to say, hey, the prices are temporarily much higher there, and I'm going to move my product over there to try to make some extra money. That means that the resupply and the elimination of the emergency situation is going to disappear a whole lot quicker if you allow the price system to work. If you don't, then the prices are going to stay low. Merchants are not going to move supplies in quickly because there's no economic incentive to do so. You're going to have to wait for the government and its emergency responders to come back and try to move the allocated gas to get into it. It's still going to happen. It's going to take a whole lot longer for that to happen if you prevent the price system from helping you in that allocation method. Now, charities. Charities can still operate, and I'm not against charity in the whole mix of things, but it can be an add-on to this particular system. So if you've got individuals who can't afford to pay the higher prices for gasoline, that's when charities can often come into play. That's where churches, for example, can offer extra benefits to some of their poorer members and say, hey, we're going to help you out and help you get the gas you need so you can get to your job. And they can better evaluate then whether a person needs help or doesn't need help because they've got a relationship with this particular poor household or individual and can make judgments about how to provide charity to the people who most need it. Now, so what are the cons? The cons are a sense of injustice or unfairness again. People don't really buy this economic argument for the most part. There's an argument that the wealthier can afford all the gas they desire if the prices rise. So it's kind of like, oh, well, the wealthy are going to be better off and the poor are always going to be worse. In general, that's always true, no matter what happens in the market. The wealthier always do better. But I would also point out that the wealthier are going to respond economically as well. And if they don't need that extra gas, they're going to say, well, I'll pay the higher price. I don't have to worry about waiting in line. I'll just have to pay the higher price. They're going to say, well, the price is going to come down in a week, so I'm not going to fill up my tank at this high price. They're going to take a smaller amount of gas because they're going to know they can get gas whenever they want it. It's the lines that create the panic. It's not the prices. The prices cause distress and worry for people because of the high price, but it's going to force them to make allocation adjustments that are in line with the limited supply that's available in the marketplace. Okay, the poor may suffer long, but they're going to suffer for less long because of prices being allowed to rise and the bad image for merchants. Now, there's a couple of other elements that are important to recognize. The shorter lines or lack of lines means there's an elimination of opportunity costs. All of those people waiting in lines in an emergency situation are all not doing something else. They're not getting their home ready for the emergency. They're not boarding up windows. They're not doing something else. And there's a common phrase you all have heard, I'm sure, which is time is money. And if you're wasting your time waiting in line, or that's the best choice for you at the moment, you could be doing something else instead. And by allowing prices to rise like a market would do, that would actually eliminate those lines because the people would be unwilling to pay many people would be unwilling to pay the higher prices. and thus they would not wait in line. But those who are in greatest need of gas are still going to get it, but they're going to have to pay a higher price for it in the marketplace. But they're going to be able to get it quickly. So you're not going to have this sort of, where am I going to get gas? How can I get it? It's always going to be available to you in a market setting, even in an emergency, as long as prices rise sufficiently enough. But one of the big effects of raising those prices is going to be to cut off what's called precautionary demand. That demand when people think the product's not going to be there in the near future, that they increase their demand accordingly because they're worried about not having it in the future. And they're worried about lines forming. And so if lines start to form, everybody else starts to get into line because they too are worried about not having it tomorrow. But if the prices rise sufficiently, then all of that precautionary demand is cut off because people would say, well, hey, I'm not going to pay that higher price for this product. And instead, they hold off and say, well, maybe the price will be lower tomorrow. And maybe I'll fill up or I'll get what gas I need. And I'm only going to buy what I need if the price is too high or much higher than I'm used to paying for gasoline. All right? And so that can reallocate gasoline so that those who need it most are the ones who are going to get it, and those who don't need it are not going to buy it. That precautionary demand is cut off, and that's why there's not long lines waiting to get these products in this type of an emergency situation. Now, one of the negatives that are often raised in this context is that because the prices rise, well, that means wealthier people can afford all the gas they want, and poorer people are going to get squeezed as a result of that. But this is presuming that poorer people are only better off if they can pay the lower prices for gasoline, when in actuality, lots of low-income individuals might be prevented from working because of having to wait in line in order to get a small amount of gas, which turns out to be insufficient for their purposes anyway. So they too might actually be better off if they could pay a higher price of gas and get it immediately rather than having to wait for it in line. All right, now, a couple of other quick points. The profit that individual merchants make, although it may be, the price they paid for the gasoline that's sitting in their storage chambers, that gas was paid for last week or the week before, and now by raising the price, they're clearly making a profit on that extra gas that they're selling. But they're also not going to get supplies as quickly supplied to them, and they're going to lose money because of volume effects during the emergency. So although they make some extra profit with the higher prices, it's probably not going to make them rich, and it's not going to make them rich for very long because the higher the prices are induced in a market setting, the more quickly resupply is going to come in from other places. And this is one of the important features that make the price effect in this situation less painful in the long run for individuals, because it is that profit incentives that's going to mobilize lots of people in the near area to rush supplies into that particular area because they can make extra money. And the other thing they're going to realize is that extra money or that profit margin is going to be greatest the faster you can get products into that market. Because as products start to move in that resupply to take advantage of the profits, that extra supply is going to start to push the price down eventually. And that price can come down really quickly if that resupply comes in from other places. But that resupply isn't going to happen as quickly. And it's only going to happen for sort of altruistic reasons if you force the prices to stay low and normal, as if you can live in a normal price situation in the face of this emergency. All right, so you're not going to get that increased supply as rapidly. And that means that if you maintain the price gouging law, it's actually going to make the emergency last that much longer. It's just going to last longer before you can get back to normal. And that's one of the downsides of putting that price gouging law into place. One other thing, determination of who gets the gas is based on self-selection. People make their own choices. Should I get gas or should I not? Should I pay the higher price or should I not? You don't have to have some sort of agency assessing, well, how much gas do you need? Why do you need it? What's your purpose? If you try to allocate gas, limited gas, on some basis, you're unlikely to get true stories that are going to be told to you, and it's going to be difficult to make determinations of who has the most need for the gas, who has least need for the gas. But in a market system, Government doesn't have to make that determination. Individuals make it themselves, right? And that makes the allocation fairer in that particular way. The last thing to point out is that charities can still operate to help those who are in need, to buy subsidies, provide subsidies to buy gasoline, which is now much more expensive for a limited period of time, and so forth and so on. All right, so the argument here, and this is an argument economists have made for a long time, is that markets can work more effectively in this particular situation, and that by trying to control the market with a price gouging law is actually going to make things worse rather than better. Now, there's one other thing I want to highlight here, and that is that regardless of whether you put the price gouging law into place and create this sense of fairness and justice for people or not, people are going to be hurt or injured as a result of the emergency regardless. So if you switched from a price gouging law to let the market work, well, guess what? A whole bunch of people are still going to be irritated, upset, pained because of the emergency, the destruction that's taking place because of the hurricane that's come through or what have you. All of that aftermath of the emergency is still going to be painful, even with the market situation set up. It's just that the pain is going to last probably a shorter amount of time and affect fewer people negatively if you allow the market to work. The pain is going to be higher, and you're going to have all sorts of extra pains induced if you introduce the price gouging law, because it's that trying to maintain normalcy in the case of an emergency that's going to create all these extra inconveniences, like the lines, like the precautionary demands, like the lack of supply that's going to come in from other places. All of those secondary effects are going to be stimulated by the government's desire to try to keep things normal when things are really not normal. An emergency is not a normal situation. It's a temporary situation that's going to resolve itself eventually. It's a question of how quickly that resolution can come about. Now, I want to highlight one other thing. I've used and made a distinction between self-interest and greed. Greed occurs if individual behavioral actions are such that you're basically transferring well-being to yourself at the expense of others, but you're not having a market efficiency improvement in the process. Self-interest, on the other hand, is trying to do what's in your own best interest, but following the rules of the game, as Milton Friedman would point out. You know, you're not taking advantage of other people through monopoly pricing, through deception, through theft, or any sort of improper behavior like that. So let me just make a distinction here in this context. Is price gouging self-interest or greed? And here I'm talking about price gouging term as it's used in the face of an emergency. Okay, so if an emergency comes about, like a hurricane is about to hit, prices would rise because of the changing market conditions, because supply and demand in the market is suddenly different today when the hurricane is about to hit than it was before. Supplies are likely to be cut off. That changes expected prices for the near future. And those are the things that's causing the price changes to come about. It's a change in normal market conditions. Okay, greed, however, occurs if the prices are induced by monopoly behavior on the part of firms, as an example. And I give you an example in the readings. You'll see there's a reading about a pharmaceutical company about 5 years ago, run by this guy named Martin Shkreli. And he purchased this pharmaceutical company at one point, and he took a drug that they were marketing and selling that was priced at about $13 per pill. And he came in, took over the company, raised the price of the pill to $750 per pill or something like that. And it created this backlash. A whole bunch of people complained about the greedy behavior on the part of this entrepreneur and how unjust and unfair it was. Well, that example or situation is exactly a case of greed, because what that individual is doing is taking advantage of a monopoly position in the market, gouging consumers by raising up the price of a product that's in great demand by a small number of people, and basically forcing them to pay a much higher price. That's price gouging, and that is unfair and inefficient in a market sense. But it's not what's going on in an emergency situation when gasoline merchants are raising the prices of gasoline because an emergency is hitting. That is stimulated by a different mechanism and should have a different evaluation about the goodness or badness of it. But most people will just put those all together and say that's the same thing, profiteering is taking place, and we ought to fight against that particular high profits that are being induced. I would argue those two are different situations, and we ought to treat them and evaluate them differently. Okay, self-interest, if there's many firms that are competing against each other to supply a good, that continues to be true even in an emergency situation. Still lots of service stations that are selling gasoline. There's lots of convenience stores that continue to sell and compete with selling ice. All of these are still there trying to supply a product that's in great need and in short supply at a particular time. So those are still happening. And then trade has to be mutually voluntary and with good information about the products being sold if self-interest is the motivation here. And that too is also happening in an emergency situation. I mean, if the price goes up a lot, you get to make a choice about whether to buy the gasoline or not buy the gasoline. You know what product you're going to get when you put it in your automobile. You know the product, you know what's available. There's competition amongst other merchants out there. All of that reflects the fact that price changes that come up out there are really motivated by self-interest rather than greed, okay? And greed can be thought of as, again, any of those sort of market behaviors that we've been highlighting that involve some sort of taking advantage of other people, generating a win-lose outcome for individuals in the marketplace because of the behavior of the greedy business person. Okay, now, just a quick reminder. So the general public believes the following. And this is just my evaluation of kind of how things work out there. The general public believes that firms, by their nature, are greedy and that greed is bad. They reflect or believe that price increases are an expression of that greed, that if they're raising their prices, like in an emergency situation, it's because they don't have good morals or good ethics and they're behaving greedily. They believe that price gouging in an emergency results in an unfair price because it's set way above the cost of production. Suffering people, especially the poor, cannot afford the higher prices. The desire to prevent unfairness inspires public calls for price gouging laws. And the government relents usually. They say, oh, well, this is what the people want. It's how a democracy works. If the people want price gouging laws, well, we'll give it to them. And so, like I said, 34 states or so have implemented price gouging laws in emergency situations to improve the outcome, to make people better off. But what I'm suggesting in this evaluation here is it's actually not achieving the purpose that's intended at all. And that's in part because of, I would say, misunderstanding about how markets work in this particular situation. Economics lesson real quick. Monopoly pricing is what we should refer to as price gouging. That is indeed greedy and economically inefficient. But price increases in an emergency, again, I would not classify that as price gouging because it's simply an efficient market allocation method for goods in short supply. Okay, a price increase, next bullet, and the resulting profit stimulates new supply. The price increase curtails precautionary and non-essential demand. The price increase is going to eliminate the cost of waiting in lines, that opportunity cost that people suffer, and that people are quite likely to suffer much less or for a longer period of time. They will suffer, but less if you allow the price increases to work. However, the most important bullet point is this last one here. No one's ever going to believe what I say or what economists say about this. The economic explanations are incredibly unpopular, and most people would just prefer to feel better about having these laws put into place and accept that it must work out better for people in the long run because it just makes sense to them. Okay, and this is how we run into this sort of issue. How do we get appropriate information out to the public to get public policies to be chosen using the appropriate, what might be the most efficient or the best methods possible? Now, with a lot of things, there's disagreement about whether something is going to work more effectively or not, and there's arguments and counter arguments. There's a little bit in this argument, but not so much. I would say the argument tilts pretty strongly, at least in my judgment, towards the economics of it rather than the general impression. But in other cases, that's not true. And in fact, we're going to talk about minimum wages next. And when we talk about that, I'm going to highlight the fact that there's people on both sides of that issue, people who believe they're good for the market and the economy, and people who believe they're bad for the market and the economy. And I'm going to give you the arguments that can be used to support either of those two particular positions.